When Marcus Thompson gave his expensive coat to a shivering girl in an alley, he had no idea it would change 3 lives forever. In that one act of kindness on a snowy December evening, fate began weaving together broken threads of a family, torn apart. A lonely widower keeping a promise to his dying wife, a homeless girl searching desperately for her sister, and a young teen at boarding school who never stopped believing her sister would find her. Sometimes the smallest gestures can lead to the biggest discoveries. And sometimes the family you're searching for has been searching for you, too. Sarah pulled the thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as another icy wind whipped through the alley. December in the city was brutal, especially when you didn't have anywhere warm to go. Her fingers had turned red from the cold, but she couldn't stop looking at the wrinkled photograph she held. "I'll find you, Emma," she whispered, touching her sister's smiling face in the picture. "I promise." The photograph showed 2 girls at a park, both with the same honey-brown hair and gap-toothed grins. Sarah was 9 in the picture, and Emma was 7. That was 3 years ago, before the foster care system had split them up, before everything changed. Sarah tucked the precious photo into her jeans pocket and huddled deeper into the cardboard box she'd found behind the fancy office building. She'd gotten pretty good at finding safe spots to sleep during the 2 weeks, since she'd run away from her latest foster home. This alley was better than most. The tall buildings blocked some of the wind, and the restaurant next door sometimes left out bags of day-old bread. As she watched people hurry past the alley, entrants in their warm winter coats, Sarah's mind drifted back to the day they took Emma away. She could still hear her sister's screams, still feel the way Emma's small fingers had slipped from her grasp as the social worker led her to a different car. "It's just temporary," they'd promised, "until we find a family that can take you both." But temporary had turned into forever. Sarah had bounced between 4 foster homes, while Emma had disappeared into the system. The social workers wouldn't tell Sarah where her sister had gone. They just said Emma had been adopted by a very nice family, and that Sarah should focus on her own fresh start. A fresh start. Sarah scoffed, her breath visible in the freezing air. Fresh starts were for people who didn't have half their heart, missing. The sound of clicking heels made Sarah shrink deeper into her box. Most people ignored her, but sometimes they called the police, and Sarah couldn't risk being sent back to foster care. Not when she was so close to finding Emma. The heels stopped at the alley entrance. "Mr. Thompson, the car is waiting," a woman's voice said. "Just a moment, Andrea." A man's deep voice echoed off the brick walls. "I thought I saw..." Footsteps approached Sarah's hiding spot. She held her breath, ready to run if needed. A tall figure in an expensive black coat stopped in front of her box. Sarah looked up to meet kind brown eyes in a worried face. "Good Lord," the man said softly. "You must be freezing." He shrugged off his coat, ignoring his assistant's protests about the designer label and the temperature. "Sir, your meeting..." "Reschedule it." The man crouched down, holding out the coat to Sarah. When she didn't move, he smiled gently. "It's all right. I have plenty more at home." Sarah hesitated. In her experience, adults didn't give things without expecting something in return. But the cold was bone deep, and the coat looked so warm. "Take it," he insisted. "Please." Her frozen fingers reached out and grasped the soft wool. The coat was still warm from his body heat as she pulled it around her shoulders. It was huge on her, like wearing a blanket. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you." The man, Mr. Thompson, looked like he wanted to say more, but his assistant cleared her throat loudly. "Sir, the board won't wait forever." "Right." He stood, straightening his suit jacket. Stay warm, little one." Sarah watched him walk away, his assistant fussing about catching a cold. As soon as they were gone, she snuggled into the coat's warmth. Her hands explored the deep pockets, finding a business card tucked into one of them. Marcus Thompson, CEO, Thompson Industries, 555, Vado 123. Sarah traced the embossed letters with her finger. She'd been looking for Emma in all the wrong places, digging through old addresses and asking around homeless shelters. Maybe what she needed was someone with connections, someone who could access records and make important people listen. A plan began forming in her mind as she read the card again. Mr. Thompson had shown her kindness when most people pretended not to see her. Would he help her again if she asked? The worst he could say was no, and Sarah was used to hearing that word. She carefully tucked the business card into her pocket next to Emma's photo. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would find his office building again and wait for him. Rich people like him had to know ways to find people, right? Sarah pulled the coat tighter, breathing in its clean, expensive smell. For the first time in 2 weeks, she felt warm. For the first time in 3 years, she felt hope. The city lights twinkled above her as night fell completely. In her pocket, Emma's photograph seemed to radiate warmth of its own. Soon, Sarah promised her sister's smiling face. Soon, we won't be alone anymore. She drifted off to sleep, dreaming of Emma's laugh and the way her sister used to braid her hair every morning before school. In her dreams, they were together again, and nothing could tear them apart. Sarah didn't know it yet, but the coat wrapped around her shoulders would lead her to so much more than just warmth on a cold winter night. The sound of late-night traffic became a lullaby, the city's constant rhythm matching Sarah's steady breathing as she slept. High above the alley, clouds gathered, promising snow by morning. But for once, Sarah didn't worry about the weather. She had a coat, a plan, and most importantly, hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. And maybe, just maybe, it would bring her one step closer to finding Emma. As the first snowflakes began to fall, they caught the streetlights' glow and sparkled like stars. They dusted Sarah's new coat with tiny diamonds, nature's decoration for the most precious gift she'd received since losing her sister. Inside the warm wool cocoon, Sarah smiled in her sleep, her hand resting protectively over the pocket that held 2 treasures, a photograph of the past and a business card that might hold the key to her future. Sarah woke to the sound of crunching snow. Her eyes flew open as footsteps approached, and she tensed inside her cardboard shelter. But instead of the harsh voice of a police officer or an angry store owner, she heard the same gentle tone from yesterday. "Hello? Are you still here?" Sarah peeked out from her box. Mr. Thompson stood in the alley's entrance, holding 2 paper bags that smelled amazing. Steam rose from coffee cups balanced in a cardboard carrier. He wore another expensive coat, dark blue this time, and looked worried as his eyes searched the alley. "I brought breakfast," he said, holding up the bags. "And hot chocolate. I thought, well, everyone needs a good meal on a snowy morning." Sarah's stomach growled loudly, making her decision for her. She crawled out of her box, still wrapped in his coat from yesterday. Snow had collected on top of it during the night, and she brushed it off as she stood. Mr. Thompson's face brightened when he saw her. "Ah, there you are. I was hoping you'd still be here." He walked closer and set the food down on a wooden crate. "I got enough for 2, if you'd like to share." Sarah nodded slowly, watching as he pulled out breakfast sandwiches, fruit, and pastries. The smell made her mouth water. She hadn't eaten a real meal since running away from her foster home. "I'm Marcus," he said, unwrapping a sandwich and holding it out to her. Marcus Thompson. Though I suppose you found that out from my card? Sarah took the sandwich with shaking hands. I'm Sarah, she whispered. Thank you for the coat. And this. Marcus smiled and settled onto another crate, seeming not to care about getting his expensive suit dirty. You're very welcome, Sarah. Would you like to tell me how long you've been out here? She took a big bite of the sandwich instead of answering. Marcus didn't push, just handed her a cup of hot chocolate and started eating his own breakfast. The food was the best thing Sarah had tasted in weeks. Warm eggs, melted cheese, and crispy bacon on a toasted bagel. 2 weeks, she finally said, after finishing half the sandwich. Since I ran away, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. From home? Foster. Home. Sarah pulled Emma's photo from her pocket, careful not to get food on it. I had to find my sister. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes drawn to the photograph. May I? He asked, holding out his hand. Sarah hesitated, then passed him the precious picture. She watched nervously as he studied it, noting how his expression changed when he looked at Emma's face. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. But that was impossible. Your sister, he said softly. What's her name? Emma. Sarah took another sip of hot chocolate, savoring its warmth. She's 2 years younger than me. They took her away 3 years ago, said they found her a forever family. But they wouldn't tell me where she went or let me talk to her. Marcus handed the photo back carefully, as if he knew how precious it was. That must have been very hard, he said. His voice sounded strange, almost strained. I have to find her. Sarah met his eyes firmly. She's all I have left. That's why I ran away. I found an old address where they said her new family might have lived. But when I got there, the building was gone. They tore it down last year. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, breaking a pastry into small pieces without eating it. Sarah, he said finally, running away is dangerous. There are people who might hurt you, especially in this weather. You need a safe place to stay. I'm not going back. Sarah scrambled to her feet, ready to run. I won't let them send me to another foster home. Not until I find Emma. Wait, please. Marcus held up his hands. I'm not calling anyone. I want to help. Sarah paused, suspicious but hopeful. Help how? I have connections. People who might be able to access adoption records, track down information. He pulled out his phone. Let me make a few calls. Maybe we can find her together, but properly, safely. Sarah slowly sat back down, studying his face for any sign of deception. But his eyes were kind, just like yesterday when he'd given her his coat. Why would you help me? Marcus smiled, but there was sadness in it. Because no child should be alone on the streets. And because... He paused, looking at his phone. Because I know what it's like to lose family. He made several calls while Sarah finished her breakfast, speaking in low tones about foster care records and adoption databases. She couldn't follow all of it, but she heard Emma's name mentioned more than once. Finally, he turned back to her. I have a guest house, he said. It's warm, safe, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, makes the best soup you've ever tasted. Would you consider staying there while we look for Emma? Just until we find her? Sarah's heart pounded. It seemed too good to be true. This kind man with his expensive coats and warm food, offering to help find Emma. But when she looked in his eyes, she saw something that made her want to trust him. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at Emma's photo. Or maybe it was just that he was the first adult in years who seemed to really see her. You promise you won't call the foster care people? I promise. Marcus held out his hand. Partners? Sarah looked at his offered hand, then at the business card she still held. Everything in her life had gone wrong since losing Emma. But maybe, just maybe, this was the universe giving her a chance to make things right. She shook his hand. Partners. As they gathered her few belongings and walked to his waiting car, Sarah didn't notice how Marcus kept glancing at her, his expression troubled. She didn't see him send a quick text message while she was buckling her seatbelt. And she certainly didn't notice how his hands shook slightly when he looked at Emma's photo again, as if he'd seen a ghost. But she did notice how the car's heater chased away the last of the morning's chill, and how the leather seats were softer than any bed she'd slept in for years. Most of all, she noticed the feeling growing in her chest, the warm, bright feeling that felt a lot like hope. The city scrolled past the windows as they drove, transforming from the gritty downtown area to tree-lined streets with huge houses. Sarah pressed her face to the glass, watching snowflakes dance in their wake. Somewhere out there, Emma was waiting. And for the first time since losing her sister, Sarah believed she might actually find her. Marcus's house was the biggest building Sarah had ever seen. It rose from behind iron gates like a castle, all stone walls and tall windows glinting in the morning sun. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Sarah counted at least 20 windows across the front. "It's a bit much for one person," Marcus said, noticing her wide eyes. "But it was my wife's dream house." "Was?" Sarah asked, catching his use of past tense. Marcus's smile turned sad. "She passed away 5 years ago. Now it's just me and Mrs. Chen, my housekeeper." He parked the car and turned to Sarah. "And now you, at least for a while." A small woman with silver-streaked black hair hurried down the front steps to meet them. She wore a blue sweater and carried an umbrella, which she held over Sarah as soon as she stepped out of the car. "This must be our guest," she said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Chen. You look half frozen, poor thing. Come inside. I have hot soup waiting." Sarah found herself swept into the house's warm interior. The entrance hall was bigger than her entire last foster home, with a crystal chandelier hanging overhead and a curved staircase leading upward. But instead of taking her further into the mansion, Mrs. Chen led her through a side door and across a snow-dusted garden path. The guest house was a cozy cottage that sat apart from the main house. It had its own little kitchen, a living room with soft couches, and a bedroom with the biggest bed Sarah had ever seen. "Bathrooms through there," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to a door. "Clean towels, new toothbrush, everything you need. Why don't you take a hot shower while I heat up the soup?" Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead. We'll talk more after you're warm and comfortable." The hot water felt like heaven. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper shower. She used the strawberry-scented shampoo twice, watching 2 weeks of dirt swirl down the drain. When she came out, she found clean clothes laid out on the bed. Soft sweatpants, thick socks, and a warm sweater, all in her size. Mrs. Chen was waiting in the kitchen with a bowl of steaming soup. "Sit, sit," she insisted. "You're much too thin." The soup was even better than Marcus had promised. Rich broth, tender chicken, and vegetables that tasted like they'd come straight from a garden. Sarah ate 2 bowls while Mrs. Chen puttered around the kitchen, humming softly. Marcus returned just as Sarah was finishing her second bowl. He carried a laptop and a stack of papers. "Ready to start looking?" he asked, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table. Sarah nodded eagerly. "Did you find anything?" "Some." He opened the laptop. "I have a friend who works in the foster care system. She's sending over Emma's file, or at least the parts of it that aren't sealed." Sealed. Adoption records are usually sealed to protect the privacy of the adoptive family, Marcus explained, typing something. But there might be clues in the public records. They spent the next few hours going through documents. Marcus had somehow gotten access to Sarah's old social worker's case notes. They learned that Emma had been adopted just 2 months after being separated from Sarah. The family requested a closed adoption, Marcus read, frowning at the screen. That means they didn't want any contact with the birth family or siblings. Sarah's heart sank. So we can't find her? There are other ways. Marcus's voice was firm. We just have to be creative. But something in his expression seemed troubled, like he was wrestling with a difficult decision. Mrs. Chen brought them cookies and hot tea as the afternoon wore on. Sarah noticed how empty the big house seemed behind her cottage windows. No family photos on the walls, no signs of children or pets. Just Marcus, rattling around in all that space alone. "What was your wife like?" she asked during a break from searching. Marcus looked surprised by the question. Catherine was extraordinary. She loved helping people, especially children. She always wanted. He stopped, swallowing hard. She would have liked you. Sarah thought she saw tears in his eyes before he turned back to the laptop. She wanted to ask more questions, but his phone rang. "Excuse me," he said, stepping outside to take the call. Through the window, Sarah watched him pace in the snow, talking intensely into the phone. His free hand made emphatic gestures, and once he ran his fingers through his hair in what looked like frustration. Mrs. Chen appeared at Sarah's shoulder. "He's been alone too long," she said softly. "This house needs children's laughter again." When Marcus came back in, his face was composed but tense. "That was my contact at the agency," he said. "She found something interesting. The family that adopted Emma. They're local, right here in the city." Sarah's heart leaped. "Really? Can we go find them?" "It's complicated." Marcus wouldn't meet her eyes. "We need to do this carefully, legally. The adoptive parents have rights too." But Sarah caught something in his voice, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. She looked around the cozy guest house at the papers scattered across the table at Marcus's troubled face. For the first time, a tiny seed of doubt crept in. Why was this wealthy stranger helping her so much? Why did he seem so affected by Emma's photo? And why did he keep making mysterious phone calls? As if reading her thoughts, Marcus finally met her gaze. Something flickered behind his eyes. Guilt? Fear? Sarah couldn't tell. But before she could ask any questions, Mrs. Chen announced it was time for dinner. "We'll keep looking tomorrow," Marcus promised, gathering the papers. "Get some rest tonight." That night, lying in the softest bed she'd ever slept in, Sarah pulled out Emma's photo again. "Something weird is going on," she whispered to her sister's smiling face. "But I'm getting closer. I can feel it." Outside her window, snow continued to fall, coating Marcus's huge empty house in white silence. Somewhere in this city, Emma was out there. And Sarah was starting to suspect that Marcus Thompson knew more about her sister's whereabouts than he was telling. Sarah woke early the next morning to find fresh snow blanketing the garden between her cottage and the main house. Mrs. Chen had already left breakfast on the kitchen counter, warm muffins and hot chocolate in a thermal mug, with a note saying she'd gone to the grocery store. Another note, this one from Marcus, said he had early meetings, but would be back by afternoon to continue their search. The thought of waiting around all day made Sarah restless. She'd never been good at sitting still, especially when answers might be just out of reach. After finishing her breakfast, Sarah pulled on her borrowed sweater and looked out the window at the main house. It stood silent and mysterious in the morning light, full of possible clues about Marcus and his connection to Emma. Would it really hurt to look around a little? The door between the garden and the main house was unlocked. Sarah slipped inside, her socked feet silent on the polished floors. The house felt different without Marcus and Mrs. Chen. Bigger, emptier, full of shadows and secrets. She wandered through rooms bigger than entire apartments she'd lived in. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel and marble. The dining room had a table long enough for 20 people, though it was clear no one had eaten there in ages. A layer of dust covered the fancy china in the cabinet. Upstairs, Sarah found more empty rooms. Guest bedrooms with perfectly made beds. A music room with a piano, its keys untouched. A library with thousands of books, but no comfortable reading. Chairs as if no one ever sat there. It was like a museum of loneliness, Sarah thought. Everything perfect and expensive, but nothing lived in, nothing loved. Then she found Marcus's study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt alive. Papers covered the big desk. A half-empty coffee mug sat on a stack of files. And on the walls, Sarah's heart stopped. The walls were covered in photographs. Family photos, she realized, moving closer. Marcus younger, smiling beside a beautiful woman with long, dark hair. That must be Catherine, his wife. Wedding photos, vacation pictures, holiday celebrations. But it was the photo in the center that made Sarah's hands shake. A teenage girl with honey brown hair, maybe 14 or 15, wearing a blue school uniform. She smiled at the camera with a familiar gap-toothed grin, one that Sarah saw every time she looked at her precious photograph. "Emma," Sarah whispered, touching the frame. The photo was recent, taken maybe 6 months ago based on the date printed in the corner. Emma looked healthy, happy, older, but it was definitely her. Sarah would know her sister's smile anywhere. "I thought I heard someone in here." Sarah spun around to find Mrs. Chen in the doorway, grocery bags still in her hands. The housekeeper didn't look angry, just sad. "That's Emma," Sarah said, pointing at the photo. "My sister. Why does Marcus have her picture? Why didn't he tell me?" Mrs. Chen set down her bags and closed the study door. "Sit down, child. There's something you should know about Marcus and Catherine." Sarah perched on the edge of a leather chair, her heart pounding. Mrs. Chen settled into another chair with a deep sigh. "Catherine couldn't have children," she began. "It broke her heart. They tried everything. Doctors, treatments, special diets. Nothing worked. Then Catherine started volunteering at the children's home." "The foster care center?" Sarah's voice shook. Mrs. Chen nodded. "She fell in love with one of the little girls there. Said she had the sweetest smile, the kindest heart. Catherine was going to adopt her, and her sister too. She had the paperwork all ready. But Catherine got sick. Very sick. Very fast. Cancer." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. Her last wish was for Marcus to adopt the little girl she'd chosen. She made him promise. But by then, the sister was in a different foster home, and the system wouldn't tell them where. Sarah's mind spun. "Emma," she whispered. "Catherine chose Emma." "Marcus tried to find you," Mrs. Chen said gently. "For 3 years, he's been searching. He hired private investigators, contacted every foster home in the state. But the records were sealed, and no one would help. So when he saw me in that alley, he recognized you from your old file photos, but he had to be sure. That's why he asked to see your picture of Emma." Mrs. Chen reached for Sarah's hand. "He's been afraid to tell you, afraid you'd be angry that he adopted her without you." Sarah stared at the photo of Emma in her uniform. Her sister had been here, in this house, all this time. While Sarah was bouncing between foster homes, Emma had been living just across the city. "Where is she now?" Sarah asked. "Boarding school in Vermont." Marcus thought it would be good for her, the best education, a chance at a fresh start. But she comes home for holidays. Mrs. Chen squeezed Sarah's hand. "She'll be home for Christmas break next week." Heavy footsteps in the hallway made them both look up. The study door opened, and Marcus stood there, his face pale. "Sarah," he said hoarsely. "I can explain." But Sarah was already moving. She ran past him, down the stairs, through the quiet rooms full of expensive, lonely things. She ran until she reached her cottage, slamming the door behind her. She pulled Emma's photo from her pocket and held it next to her phone, where she'd taken a picture of the school portrait in Marcus's study. The same smile, the same eyes. Her sister, growing up without her, while Marcus Thompson kept the truth locked away in his perfect, empty house. The snow fell harder outside her window as Sarah sank onto her bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. She'd found Emma at last, but nothing about this discovery felt like the happy ending she'd imagined. A soft knock on the cottage door made Sarah wipe her eyes quickly. "Go away," she called out, her voice rough from crying. "I brought hot chocolate," Mrs. Chen's gentle voice answered. "And answers, if you want them." Sarah hesitated, then walked to the door. Mrs. Chen stood there with 2 steaming mugs and a worried expression. Behind her, through the swirling snow, Sarah could see Marcus, pacing in his study window. "He's not coming," Mrs. Chen assured her. "Not until you're ready." Sarah let her in, taking one of the mugs. They sat on the cottage's small couch, and Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. "Why didn't he tell me right away?" she asked finally. "When he saw my picture of Emma?" Mrs. Chen blew on her hot chocolate. "Fear, mostly, and guilt. He's carried that guilt for 3 years, adopting Emma without you, not being able to find you sooner. Does Emma know about me? She never stops talking about you." Mrs. Chen pulled something from her sweater pocket, a small photo album. "She carries your picture everywhere, tells everyone about her brave big sister." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the album. The first photo showed Emma on what must have been her first day at the mansion. She wore a brand new dress and an uncertain smile. The next showed her at the piano, at a school play, at the beach, growing up in snapshots. "She missed you every day," Mrs. Chen said softly. "Asked Marcus constantly if he'd found you yet. That's why he hired the private investigators, why he kept searching even when everyone said to give up. But he still sent her away to boarding school," Sarah said bitterly. "Emma wanted to go. She's brilliant at science. The school has special programs for that. But she calls home 3 times a week." Mrs. Chen touched Sarah's hand. "Would you like to see her room?" Sarah looked up, surprised. "Here?" Mrs. Chen nodded. "Marcus kept it ready, hoping someday you'd both be here. Come." They walked through the snow to the main house. Instead of going to the formal areas Sarah had explored earlier, Mrs. Chen led her up a different staircase to a wing she hadn't seen. Emma's room was everything their shared foster home rooms had never been. Pale blue walls covered in science posters, a desk scattered with textbooks and chemistry models, and everywhere pictures of Sarah. Their old photo from the park was framed on the bedside table. School photos Sarah remembered giving Emma were pinned to a bulletin board. Even a crayon drawing they'd made together hung on the wall in a fancy frame. "She never forgot you," Mrs. Chen said quietly. and neither did Marcus. As if summoned by his name, there was a soft knock on the door. Marcus stood in the hallway, looking more uncertain than Sarah had seen him yet. "May I come in?" he asked. Sarah nodded slowly, sinking onto Emma's perfectly made bed. Mrs. Chen squeezed her shoulder and slipped out, leaving them alone. "I've made so many mistakes," Marcus said, staying by the door. "I should have told you the truth right away in that alley, but when I saw you there, wearing my coat, looking so much like the photos in Emma's album, I panicked. I was afraid you'd run before I could explain." "Did Catherine really want to adopt both of us?" Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "It was her dying wish. Find her sister, she made me promise. Don't let them grow up apart. I tried, Sarah. I tried so hard to find you." He pulled out his phone, showing her emails to social workers, private investigators, foster care officials. Hundreds of them, spanning 3 years. "The system is designed to protect privacy," he explained. "No one would tell me where you were. Each time I got close, you'd been moved to a new home. I almost gave up hope." "Does Emma know you found me?" Marcus shook his head. "I wanted to be sure first. And I wanted to give you the choice. This is your sister, your life. If you don't want to stay here, if you'd rather we helped you find a different family—" "No!" Sarah surprised herself with how quickly she answered. "I want to see Emma. I want—" "To be a family?" Marcus asked softly. Sarah looked around the room that had been waiting for her all this time. At the photos of her sister, growing from a scared little girl into a confident teenager. At the man who had never stopped searching for her. Catherine would have been a wonderful mother, Marcus said. She saw something special in Emma right away. She said any girl with such a loyal, brave sister had to be special. "Tell me about the day you adopted her," Sarah asked, hugging one of Emma's pillows. Marcus sat in Emma's desk chair, his eyes distant with memory. "She was so quiet at first. Wouldn't let go of your picture. The social worker said she cried every night for you." "I cried too," Sarah whispered. "But then Catherine got sick. And Emma? She was amazing. She'd read to Catherine in the hospital, tell her stories about, you, make her laugh." After Catherine died, it was just the two of us, helping each other heal. Sarah wiped her eyes. "And now? Now she's thriving at school. Top of her class in chemistry. Wants to be a scientist." Pride filled his voice. "But she still sets a place for you at holiday dinners. Still tells everyone about her amazing sister who protected her in foster care." A phone rang downstairs, making them both jump. Marcus checked his phone, and his eyes widened. "It's Emma," he said. "Her weekly call. Would you like to talk to her?" Sarah's heart pounded. I don't know what to say. How about we just tell her she's getting an early Christmas present this year?" Marcus smiled. "She's coming home next week for break. But I could ask the school to let her come home sooner, if you want." Sarah looked at the photo of her and Emma on the bedside table. 3 years of separation. 3 years of missing pieces. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to put their family back together. The phone kept ringing as Sarah made her decision. Sarah nodded, and Marcus answered the phone, putting it on speaker. "Hi, sweetheart. Dad!" Emma's voice filled the room. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Her sister's voice was deeper now, but still unmistakably Emma. "You'll never guess what happened in chemistry class today." Marcus caught Sarah's eye, silently, asking if she was ready. Sarah took a deep breath and whispered, "Hi, Emma." The line went completely silent. Then, in a shaking voice, Emma said, "Sarah, is that Is that really you? It's me, Em. Sarah was crying now, but she didn't care. I found you. A sob burst through the speaker. Sarah! Oh my God! Sarah! Where are you? How did you… Dad, is she really there? In my room? She's here, sweetheart. Marcus was wiping his eyes too. I found her yesterday, or rather, she found me. She's been looking for you. Don't move, Emma ordered. Don't you dare move, Sarah. I'm packing my bag right now. Dad, call the school. Tell them it's a family emergency. Tell them, already done, Marcus said. I called them this morning, just in case. There's a car waiting to bring you home. They could hear drawers slamming and zippers closing through the phone. Sarah! Emma's voice was urgent. Promise you'll be there when I get home. Promise you won't disappear again. I promise, Em. Sarah hugged Emma's pillow tighter. I'm not going anywhere. 4 hours, Emma said. That's how long the drive takes. 4 hours and 17 minutes exactly. Will you stay on the phone with me? For the next hour, they talked non-stop. Emma told Sarah about her science projects, her friends at school, her dreams of becoming a researcher. Sarah told carefully edited versions of her foster homes, focusing on the better moments. Marcus sat quietly in the desk chair, listening, with a soft smile. Finally, Emma had to hang up as the car reached a patchy service area in the mountains. 4 hours and 17 minutes, she repeated. I love you, Sarah. I never stopped loving you. I love you too, Em. See you soon. After the call ended, Sarah felt drained, but lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried for 3 years had finally lifted. She looked around Emma's room with new eyes, seeing signs of her sister's personality she'd missed before. A collection of rocks on the windowsill, a stuffed penguin she remembered Emma loving, science fair ribbons pinned proudly on the wall. Thank you, she said to Marcus, for taking care of her, for giving her all of this. Sarah, Marcus leaned forward. I'd like to give you all of this too, if you want it. She stared at him. What do you mean? I mean, I'd like to adopt you. Legally, properly. Make you and Emma sisters in the eyes of the law again. He ran a hand through his hair nervously. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know I can never replace your parents, but I'd like to try to be a father to you, the way I've tried to be for Emma. Sarah looked at the photo of Catherine on Emma's bulletin board, the woman who had wanted both sisters, who had made her husband promise to find Sarah. Would you tell me more about Catherine? She asked. Emma said on the phone that she calls you Dad now. Did Catherine, was she mom to her? Marcus smiled sadly. She was, for those few precious months we had together. Catherine had this way of making everyone feel special, loved. The day she met Emma at the children's home, she came home glowing. I met our daughter today, she told me, but she wanted both of us? She insisted on it, said she could see how much Emma loved you, how brave you were to protect her in foster care. She started the paperwork right away to adopt you both. Marcus's voice cracked. Then the doctors found the cancer. It was so aggressive. We only had 3 months with her. Her last coherent words were making me promise to find you. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, trying to imagine it. Having a mom again, even for just 3 months. Emma said, Catherine used to read to her in the hospital? Marcus nodded. Every night. She had this book of fairy tales. Emma would curl up next to her bed, and Catherine would read until she was too tired. Then Emma would take over, reading the stories. To Catherine, she said she was practicing for when we found you. A thought struck Sarah. Is that why, in the guest house, there are all those books? Catherine picked them out, Marcus admitted. For both of you. She had such plans. Reading together, in the library, helping with homework, teaching you both to play piano like she did. After she died, I couldn't bear to change anything. I just waited, hoped that somehow, someday, I'd find you and her dream of having both her daughters here could come true. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway with sandwiches and tea. Emma just texted, she said. They're making good time. 3 hours now. Sarah accepted a sandwich, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. As she ate, she watched Marcus straighten Emma's already neat room, adjusting picture frames and smoothing the bedspread. You're nervous too, she realized. He gave a shaky laugh, terrified. I've imagined this moment for 3 years. Having both of you here, being a real family. I just hope... He trailed off. Hope what? Hope I can be enough. I'm not Catherine. I'm not naturally good at this whole dad thing. I'm learning as I go. Sarah thought about the coat he'd given her in the alley, the breakfast he'd brought, the way he'd respected her space when she was angry. I think you're doing okay, she said softly. His smile lit up the whole room. They spent the next few hours getting Sarah's cottage room packed up. She would move into the bedroom next to Emma's, which Catherine had decorated for her years ago. Mrs. Chen kept bringing up snacks and tissues, dabbing at her own eyes as she watched them work. Finally, crunching gravel announced a car in the driveway. Sarah ran to the window. Through the swirling snow, she saw a teenage girl leap from the back seat before the car had fully stopped. Emma looked up, her face finding Sarah's window instantly. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then Emma was running, her boots leaving tracks in the snow, her honey-brown hair streaming behind her. Sarah flew down the stairs, through the halls she'd explored that morning, out the front door. They crashed together in the middle of the snowy driveway, holding each other so tight it hurt. Emma was taller now, but she still fit perfectly in Sarah's arms. You found me, Emma kept whispering. You really found me. I never stopped looking, Sarah promised, pressing her face into her sister's hair. Never. Marcus stood on the front steps, watching his daughters reunite as the snow fell softly around them. And somewhere, Sarah thought, Catherine was watching too, smiling as her final wish came true at last. 1 year later, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the new dress Mrs. Chen had helped her pick out. Through her window, she could see snow falling again. December had come full circle, bringing with it memories of cold alleys and warm coats, of searching and finding, of broken pieces finally coming together. Sarah! Emma's voice called from down the hall. Dad says we're going to be late. Coming. Sarah smiled at her reflection one last time. The girl in the mirror looked nothing like the one who had huddled in a cardboard box a year ago. This girl had bright eyes, warm clothes, and most importantly, a family. She stepped into the hallway to find Emma waiting, practically bouncing with excitement. Her sister wore a matching dress in different colors, blue for Emma, green for Sarah. Their Christmas photo dresses, as Mrs. Chen called them. Finally! Emma grabbed her hand. Come on! Everyone's waiting in the library. The library had changed dramatically over the past year. Gone were the stiff, unused furniture and dusty shelves. Now, comfortable chairs clustered around a crackling fireplace, and books lay open on every surface. Emma's science texts mixed with Sarah's art books, and Marcus's business journals. Marcus stood by the fireplace, fiddling with a camera on a tripod. He'd traded his business suits for casual clothes on weekends now, though he still couldn't quite manage to look completely relaxed in jeans. "There are my girls," he said, smiling, as they entered. His eyes grew suspiciously bright, as they often did when he looked at his daughters together. "Ready for the annual Thompson family Christmas photo?" Mrs. Chen hurried in with last-minute adjustments, smoothing Emma's hair, straightening Sarah's necklace. The necklace had been Catherine's, given to Sarah on her last birthday. Emma wore its match. "Now then," Mrs. Chen said, stepping back to study them. "Perfect. Though Sarah, dear, you might want to show your adoption certificate. It's your first Christmas as an official Thompson, after all." Sarah touched the framed certificate she held. The ink was barely dry. Her adoption had been finalized just last week, right before Christmas break started. Now, she and Emma were sisters in every way that mattered, legally as well as in their hearts. "Okay, everyone in position," Marcus said, setting the camera timer. He hurried to stand between his daughters, one arm around each of them. On the mantel above them, Catherine's photo smiled down at her family. The camera flashed, capturing the moment forever. Two sisters holding, hands across their father's chest, an elderly housekeeper beaming from the side. A family built from love rather than blood. "Perfect," Mrs. Chen declared, checking the photo. "Now, who's ready for hot chocolate?" As they settled into their usual spots, Emma and Sarah sharing the oversized armchair, Marcus in his leather chair, Mrs. Chen serving drinks from her special Christmas tray. Sarah thought about how much had changed in just 1 year. Emma was still at boarding school, but she came home every weekend now. Her science projects had grown more ambitious, spreading across the dining room table until Mrs. Chen insisted they convert one of the empty rooms into a proper laboratory. Sarah had started at the local private school, discovering a talent for art that Marcus encouraged with proper supplies and classes. The huge house had transformed from a museum of loneliness into a real home. Family photos covered the walls, not just the old ones of Catherine, but new ones too. Sarah and Emma making snow angels in the front yard, Marcus attempting, and failing, to teach them both to cook. Mrs. Chen showing them how to make dumplings in the kitchen. "Remember last Christmas?" Emma asked, sipping her hot chocolate. "When you first came home?" Sarah nodded. That first Christmas had been a mixture of joy and awkwardness as they all learned how to be a family. Emma had barely left Sarah's side for 2 weeks, as if afraid her sister would disappear again. Marcus had overwhelmed them both with presents, trying to make up for lost time. Mrs. Chen had cooked enough food for an army. "Dad cried when we all opened presents together," Emma continued, grinning at Marcus. "I did not," Marcus protested. "I had something in my eye." "For 2 hours?" Sarah teased. They all laughed, and Sarah felt that warm glow that came with belonging somewhere, with people who loved you completely. "I have something for everyone," Marcus said suddenly. "I know we usually wait for Christmas morning, but..." He pulled wrapped packages from behind his chair. Sarah opened hers to find a photo album. Inside were pictures she'd never seen before. Her and Emma as tiny children with their birth parents, school photos from their early foster care days, newspaper clippings about Emma's science fair victories. "How did you?" she breathed. "I never stopped looking," Marcus said softly. "Even after we found you, I kept searching. For your history, your memories. I thought you both deserved to have them." Emma's album was identical, and soon both girls were crying as they flipped through pages of their shared past. Even Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "Catherine would be so proud," Mrs. Chen said, squeezing Marcus's shoulder. "Of all of you." Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep reading science magazines and Mrs. Chen had gone home, Sarah found Marcus in his study. He sat at his desk, looking at the photo wall that had first revealed the truth to Sarah a year ago. "Thank you," she said from the doorway, "for everything." Marcus turned, his eyes soft. "I should be thanking you, Sarah. You and Emma. You made this house a home again, made me a father, gave me a family." Sarah walked over and hugged him, something that had gotten easier with each passing month. "Catherine chose well," she said, "when she chose you to be our dad." Marcus hugged her back, and for a moment, they just stood there, father and daughter, watching the snow fall outside. The same snow that had witnessed their first meeting in that alley, that had covered Sarah's footprints as she'd run from this very study upon discovering the truth, that had welcomed Emma home to her sister. Sarah thought about the scared, cold girl she'd been, clutching a photograph and searching for her sister. She thought about Marcus, keeping his promise to his dying wife. About Emma, never losing faith that her sister would find her. About Mrs. Chen, helping them all heal and grow together. Sometimes families weren't what you expected them to be. Sometimes they were built slowly, with patience and love and a little bit of fate. Sometimes they came together like snowflakes, each one unique and perfect in its own way. And sometimes, Sarah thought as she headed to bed that night, the best Christmas presents didn't come in wrapped packages at all. Sometimes they came in the form of a warm coat on a cold night, leading you exactly where you needed to be. Thanks so much for staying until the end of this heartwarming story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location in the comments below. This tale of family, hope, and unexpected connections resonated with so many of you, and I'm grateful to share these stories with our growing community. If you enjoyed Sarah and Emma's journey to finding each other, please hit that like button. It really helps others discover these stories too. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next story time together. I post new stories every day that I hope will touch your heart, just like this one. Until next time, keep believing in the power of hope and kindness. Sometimes, the most beautiful endings start with one small act of compassion. See you in the next story.